I've spent my career building brands and businesses, both for myself and other people, and I focus really on top line revenue growth. So that really means what can you say, do, offer, motivate, provide to your customers, whether they're consumers, they're doctors, they're healthcare professionals, they're payers. What can you do to motivate them to engage in a transaction? So anything that drives top line revenue growth. I got my foundational training at Johnson & Johnson many years ago. And those relationships have been fundamental to everything that I've done since. So I've clients that I've worked with for 20 years while I've moved from company to company that somehow trace back to a connection that I had at J&J. A lot of my work for the first major part of my career was for companies like that, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck, Bayer, Church & Dwight, Allergan, large companies with a particular focus on businesses that affect women, of which there are many, anything from the top of their head to the tips of their toes. And it could be things that are less serious, like hair care, skin care, oral care, to menstruation, fertility, infertility, foot fungus, hemorrhoids, you name it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. About 11 years ago, my business partner and I raised a lot of venture capital and bought an asset that improved arousal, desire, and satisfaction for women. It was topically applied, and it was demonstrated to be safe and effective, regardless of age and life stage. And that is when I became a vagipreneur, a person in the business of female sexual health. And since building and selling that business several years ago, I've stayed in the space, and I do the same kinds of work now, not owning a product company, but working with many, many different kinds of companies in the space of female sexual and reproductive health. So think anything from menstruation to menopause, pregnancy, fertility, infertility, disease prevention, incontinence, hot flashes, you name it. I probably am working with or have worked with a company or companies that focus on providing solutions in that space.
So you figured out the vagipreneur model pretty much. You understand the audience, who they are, what they need, what works, what doesn't. And I'm guessing you accelerate growth by knowing all those things. That's the objective. So when I work with a company, and I've had my own company, consulting boutique for over 2 decades at this point, I work with them to figure out what the business objectives are and what are the levers that we can pull to help them get there. So for instance, in some cases, it's a strategic partnership. They need to be working with a large manufacturer or marketer who has the resources, financial and personal, to drive growth. So many of the businesses I work with have strong online businesses, and they don't have the retail relationships, which are very expensive to build and very time consuming. So often I'm bringing smaller companies, startup or venture-backed companies, to corporate venture capital in the areas that those companies are interested in, to say, here's a new way to approach that. Here's a way to reach millennials. Here's a new business model. Here's new solution based on improved materials technology. So it's all really, as I said, focused on top line growth. It could be funding related. It could be positioning. It could be messaging. It could be better identification of target. So it's not sufficient in my world to say we're going after millennial women. That could be many kinds of businesses. So all of the work that I've done in sexual health and apart from is really always focusing on understanding the buyer, understanding the user. And when there's more than one, obviously in most businesses there is a system, certainly in female sexual health there is, understanding what is valuable to all the people in that system. How granular do you go?
In terms of the kind of work that I do?
In terms of defining that customer profile, if you like, in terms of understanding the customer. How granular do you actually go? This is more of a personal curiosity.
Yeah. I will go as granular as the client will let me. I'm very aggressive about telling them when I don't think the definition is precise enough. But one of the challenges of being a service provider and a partner is you don't always get to make that decision. So for me, when I'm working on businesses and I'm a true partner, I want to get very granular. I want to know how they feel. I want to know where they live. I want to know what solutions they're using. I want to know what their family life is. I want to know what they would be trading it out for. I want to understand if they're not using something, why they're not using something. I want to understand, is it different because of their cultural background or the part of the country that they live in? So much bigger than, you know, the old traditional TV demographic, but really understanding what their journey is. How are they going to enter my category or the category of the company that I'm working with? How are they going to make the decisions? At what points can I motivate them to do different things or to consider new choices? And one of the challenges, particularly in female sexual health, you know, in many categories, let's say hair care, skin care, whatever it is, people are using something. And so what you're asking them to do is switch or take a percentage of their usage occasions from shampoo A to shampoo B, or moisturizer C to moisturizer D. In many aspects of female sexual and reproductive health, you're getting people from inaction or inertia to making a choice. So there are many categories that I work in where women haven't thought about these solutions before. You know, take incontinence. That's not something that women want to think about or deal with. The traditional solutions have been pads, and, you know, there's a lot of, they do part of the job, they don't do all of the job. And now there are so many devices in development that could not only reduce the symptoms, but also potentially enhance intimacy. That's not a calculation or a conversation that many consumers have had before. And one of the amazing...
And I would assume also knowing when and how to have that conversation is extremely important, especially in that industry.
Yes, and one of the things I've spent a lot of my career on, especially in female sexual health, is really this language. You know, I use a fairly extreme example, but we're now in, you know, decade 3 of having the erectile dysfunction drugs in our universe. And so there's a whole generation of young men and women who were brought up with this idea of bigger, longer, stronger, and 4-hour erections. That language, in my experience, having worked with and interviewed and done quantitative and qualitative research with thousands of women, that language isn't how they think about sex. They don't think about it as a performance sport. So one of the most important things, and what many of the companies that I work with are doing, is they want to create a different feeling, a different experience, a different sense of access. And when we were running Zestra, one of the things that we found is whenever we could be defining the message, whenever we could be speaking, whether it was virtually or in front of a room, and because we felt comfortable with the topic and were knowledgeable about solutions, it really enabled people to engage in conversation. And so many of the founders that I work with have done the very same thing, and they've taken it even further. So they've figured out how to make shopping for a vibrator or arousal products more enjoyable. They figured out how to make it more fun and easier to understand. They figured out how to make it seamless in terms of delivery and being able to create your own set of products that you want to use. So much of it is, whether it's in person in a retail setting or direct to consumer or in any kind of social media communication, it's about creating a tone that your consumer can engage in and feels comfortable with. So, you know, we always talk about building a community, but I think it's even more important in female sexual health, where for many years in many of these categories, we didn't really have a language. They would say, you know, the manufacturers would say, you have a problem, here's our solution. The conversations I like to have, and the companies that I work with like to have, is looking at her as a total human being. So you're not just a menstruating person. You're not just a person trying to get pregnant. You're a person who has these range of experiences across your reproductive life, and at different stages in that life, you're going to want different products, and you're going to want different solutions, and you're going to want to have a different conversation.
That's extremely insightful, a very, very interesting way of looking at it. There is a term I hate, but I will use anyway. Also, I think for a decent period of time, certain products were marketed to women in what would be deemed a masculine, competitive, like this speed and let's give you technical and so on, as opposed to a feminine marketing approach. And by that, I don't mean the traditional gender role of masculine and feminine, but there's been studies done, as I'm sure you're probably more up to date with them than I am, in terms of the tone and how we talk to people in marketing. And I think it's important to our audience as entrepreneurs to really understand their customer, especially as they branch out. A lot of entrepreneurs start businesses where really they're their first own customer. And that's the one they know, and that's the voice they keep. But as they get a broader audience and start to serve a wider market, I think a lot of that can be lost, that we no longer know how to communicate because we don't really understand this new type of customer that's experiencing life in a different way. But
so it's a great point, because one of the things, when I went to business school, they would say, never assume you're the target customer. Then you have a data set of N=1. What I see very frequently in female sexual health is that the founders experience a problem at some point in their sexual and reproductive life. They look around for a solution. They don't find one that's sufficient. They create one, and then they say, wow, if this works for me, maybe there are lots of other people like me for whom this could be useful. So the personal becomes really part of the story, which is a double-edged sword for women in general, and specifically when you're talking about female sexual health. But to me, when I'd written the book Orgasmic Leadership, I interviewed over 36 entrepreneurs, academics, and healthcare practitioners, and so many of their stories and their businesses and their passions were powered by an experience where it just didn't work for them. They didn't see the products that they wanted because, for instance, the lubricants had too many ingredients that they had a negative reaction to, or the shops they were going into didn't cater to someone their age. So absolutely, I think it's an incredibly important starting point. But you have to understand and really break down, if I am the customer, what is it about me that attracts me to the solution? And can I find like people who will also be attracted to the solution?
I would also,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I would also imagine that as you start to move from state to state or taking a company global, that's also something that comes up quite a bit, is the messaging might need to be different. I've done some work in North Africa, Middle East, and as you can tell from my accent, I'm a half and half. I'm a true American born here, but then I've lived abroad quite a bit. And one thing I see, not necessarily from a marketing perspective, but the way people engage with brands is different throughout the world. It's becoming more homogeneous in a way because of the internet and so on, but still the engagement is different. And
absolutely. So, historically, when I was growing up in business, there's only one brand I could think of that had a really strong social mission, and that was Ben & Jerry's. And they gave 10% of their profits to charities. But people bought their ice cream, and still do, because it's delicious. The social entrepreneurship piece was a nice to have. Mm-hmm. Certainly for many of the businesses that I work with and many of the businesses that are being created every day, that social entrepreneurship and the idea of giving back is critical. It's central to the ideas of the brand. And, again, to make a gross generalization, for millennials, that's extremely important to them. They are much more aware of our relationship to the planet. They're much more aware of waste. So just to give, one of my favorite examples of a company that did this, a woman by the name of Suhani Jalata. I discovered her reading my alumni magazine, and we clearly were there decades apart. She had grown up in India in relative privilege, and her father was in the government. And so she had the opportunity to see some of the situations in this very vast and complicated country that people experienced. And one of the things that struck her was the sanitation for the women in the slums of Mumbai. Well, certainly for everybody in the slums of Mumbai, but particularly for women. And So she built a business while she was in college. She's in her mid to late 20s at most.
Impressive.
Yeah, amazing. And she decided that she was going to tackle the piece that was about menstruation. In developing countries, girls and women miss as many as 3 to 7 days a month of work or school because they don't have access to sanitary protection. So Suhani's approach was she created a company that understood the circumstances that these women are living in. You know, you can't say, well, you should have indoor plumbing if they don't have it. So what she did is she designed a product that fit better in the sanitation conditions that they had. And she taught women how to make it. So
Wow.
not only did they have a solution so that they could go about their day, but they now had an economic engine. They could now participate in making and selling these products because they certainly understood their neighbors way better than an outsider would. And to me, what's so brilliant about that is it is truly social entrepreneurship. You are running a business and you are providing skills that literally can change the trajectory of somebody's life and give them economic opportunities. That to me is like the holy grail of social entrepreneurship. And one of my favorite stories about Suhani is in 2016, she was awarded Glamour College Student of the Year from Glamour magazine. And at that time, a woman who was famous, but not as famous as she is now, was also there, took an interest, came to visit Suhani, had her at her location where she was building the products in India. That woman then became engaged to Prince Harry, and in lieu of gifts, the prince and princess decided that they wanted people to give to 7 organizations in lieu of gifts, and one of them was Suhani's charity and Suhani's foundation. And my favorite part is Suhani got invited to the wedding, the royal wedding, and she went. So, you know, it's amazing. Many of the people who are in other parts of the world where they're making menstrual products, for every one they sell or box they sell, they donate, or they invest in a factory that helps people in that community learn how to make the products that they're selling. So social entrepreneurship is so central to the fabric of brands that are being created today. And I see that in general, and I see it very specifically and very beautifully in female health.
So in a sense, actually, what she's doing is a step beyond, let's say, Bombas, right? Where they're giving one pair of socks. It's a company that a lot of people are aware of. But she's going with the old adage of teach a man to fish.
Exactly.
In this case, teach a woman to make her own menstrual pads and
so
sell them and build their own business, which is really a step further.
It's amazing. It's like it's the Avon lady of the new millennium. It's really pretty extraordinary, and exactly how you summarized it is right. And these are amazing people. And what I love about so many of the entrepreneurs in this space, that's one of the reasons that I stay so engaged, is the people who choose to be in this space are just fascinating and interesting, and I learn from them, and I'm motivated by the kinds of work that they do. And so I love being part of this community of people who work in this space. But they're also not just starting non-for-profits or nonprofits. It's great to make money so that you can have the power, you can have economic power to contribute to society. You don't have to feel bad. And, more and more women every day get that. You should be proud that you're running a successful business, and you can also give back to the community. It doesn't have to be an enterprise that doesn't generate any revenue for you to feel good about it. And that's not, nonprofits are critical. And, you certainly look now with what's going on in the world with COVID-19, we couldn't function without the nonprofits and the organizations. So this in no way minimizes what they're doing, but there is a different kind of power associated with building a business and then figuring out what you're going to do with the profits of that business in a way that's meaningful to you as a founder or a manager or a board member.
I think actually under current conditions, it could go either way depending on how funding gets funneled and how long it lasts. But I think there might be an entrepreneurial boom and actually a shift in the way we see our lives and kind of how interconnected we are. Because if this was ever a great example of the butterfly effect or the ripple
Exactly.
effect, this is impressively so. And it could have been any other event that might have caused this, because every so often you get something like this. It could have been war, sadly.
Right.
Drought, especially with a lot of the things
Things
going
that are
on.
totally outside of our control.
Outside of our control, but statistically certain if we look at history. But we like to forget history very often, which will actually bring me to the intent of our conversation, because I've had a lot of fun discussing your subject, which I can see, like, I don't believe you work a day in your life, because you look like you love what you do. And by work, I mean something that you do because you have to, as opposed to because you want to, right?
Yeah.
Not effort and impulse.
Although I have to say, I spend a lot of time with university kids and business students. And I will say, I love what I do, but I think we're maybe misrepresenting to the new generation that entrepreneurship is easy and glamorous, and that it doesn't feel like work. I have plenty of days where it feels like work, but I have way more where I'm energized and engaged. So what I like to think about is the ratio has to be right. It has to feel like something that's motivating you and inspiring you way more often than it feels like, oh, how am I going to get out of bed and even think about the things on my list. But one more thing about COVID, I have 2 young adult children, and they said something so funny. You know, our parents or grandparents would say, this is where I was when Kennedy was shot or during World War II. And, you know, our kids were saying to us, we'll now say to our kids, let us tell you where we were when this global pandemic happened. This is, you know, for kids who are not old enough to have lived through 9/11, you know, as adults who don't have those clear memories. So for a lot of kids, that's their first memory of something like this. But where were we? What was I doing when the world shut down and when people were getting sick and you had to be constantly thinking of your neighbor? You're staying inside to help yourself, and you're also staying inside to help the person who lives next door. Anyway, I digress.
I remember where I was on September 11.
So do I.
Was a big one, but also I agree. I don't think this generation, especially in the Western world, we've had it good. But on a personal note, we've all been through adversity.
Absolutely.
Right? So what I'd like to know, and you seem to have had a very interesting career, and when has it been, if you had to go back and look at your life, which is maybe the mountain you're proudest of climbing in terms of facing adversity?
So it's an interesting question, because one of the things I tell my kids when they're doing something hard is think of a time that you felt strong, that you were the most proud of the person you were. So my example isn't a business example, although it ultimately has an impact on business. About 15 years ago, I was in a terrible bike accident. I was wearing a helmet, but the details don't matter. When flying over the handlebars, broke both my wrists, lacerated my liver, and had a head injury. And I basically couldn't do anything for 6 months, and I couldn't get in the car except to go to a doctor. So I was quarantined, for lack of a better word.
Right.
And I really didn't have stamina when I first had the accident. And I broke both my wrists. So I didn't realize my first surgery was on my right wrist. So I'm already using, and I'm a righty, I was using my non-dominant hand. And then it turns out that was broken also. So a couple things. I remember waking up in the hospital very clearly after a couple of days in ICU saying, I am going to get better. I'm going to do whatever it takes, and I'm going to, whatever impact my attitude has on this, I am going to do whatever I can to heal. And I sort of had this idea that I knew I was going to be okay. Although there wasn't a lot of evidence at that particular moment, 3 days after the accident, when I literally couldn't move. I couldn't pick up a glass of water. I couldn't brush my own teeth. I literally couldn't do anything. And so I would say it took me 18 months to feel back to my regular level of energy. So I went from 100 miles an hour, which I think you can tell from the way that I speak, to 0. And so I had to recalibrate everything in my life. And I went to hand therapy and I learned how to do a lot of things over again. And I eventually stopped having headaches and I stopped having to sleep all the time. And I feel like coming out of that with an even greater appreciation for time, for luck, for personal strength, for community, because you can't recover from something like that. I had 2 young kids at the time, and I was working full time and traveling, and I had to redo my entire life. And so it really gave me an appreciation similar to COVID. I don't wish any of these things, and I am not of the belief that things happen for a reason. I like to think more so that you make reason out of what happens. So I would never say, wasn't it great? I fell off a bicycle and my kids were terrified and my husband was terrified and my business partner was terrified and everybody and my mom and everybody in my life. But the experience that I had going from 0 back to, let's hope 100, but let's even say 95, gave me such a feeling of my own strength and ability to survive.
Where did you get that mindset you're wearing?
Totally from my parents. I mean, there are a couple of things that stand out, and they don't all sound serious, but I was one of 2 girls, and we were athletic, and my father always helped us with sports, and we watched all the sports movies. And our favorite movie, and look, when my kids wanted to start watching Rocky, I said, oh, you have to watch 1 through 5. You can't just start in the middle. So my dad really had this attitude of never quit, never say die. And there was a line from the movie, the movie that was the most meaningful to us was Rollerball, which was a futuristic roller derby where men on skates with spike gloves and spikes on their motorcycles took this huge solid metal ball, and you had to get it into the bullseye, and you won when the other team was dead. So, not that happy, friendly a movie. But right before every match, my recollection was the referee in the movie would say, no timeout, no substitution. And my dad always translated that to, people are counting on you, in the proverbial and the literal game. People are counting on you. You have a role. There's no one on the bench to take your place. You need to work as hard as you can, as long as you can, as efficiently as you can, and then come back and do it the next day. And he also applied that perspective to how he built relationships, how he built our family, how he built his career, how he engaged with people in the community. So he was such a complete person, and I look to him as the way that I learned to do so much of what was hard. And from my mother's perspective, she was a therapist when I was growing up, and she would say to me, whenever you feel down, for whatever the reason, whether it's teenage angst or it's something real, go out and do something for somebody else, and that will make you feel better. So, you can't choose your parents, and, no one's childhood is perfect, but I did have parents who really ground me in a strong sense of values. And my dad used to say, I just was talking to someone today who had written an article about a guy whose business literally closed overnight. He had 15 years in his business, successful hospitality business had closed, and he shared his friend's sort of words of wisdom. And I wrote back and I said, this so reminds me, similar to what we're talking about now, of what my dad would say, which is, it doesn't matter how many times you fall down. It matters how you behave when you get up. So sent a quote from an article about Scott Hamilton, who was an Olympic and professional ice skater. And I don't know if you know anything about his background, but he had cancer a number of times. He faced a lot of adversity and also had a lot of success. And at the last Winter Olympics, I think, or maybe 2 times ago, he was sort of demoted from the lead skating commentator. And someone asked him how he felt. And, you know, he's very focused on the future, and he has an organization called Get Up. And I'm not going to quote the number right, but he said, listen, I've fallen down in skating 18,000 times, 41,000 times. I don't know what the number is, but tens of thousands. And he says, and I've gotten up every time. And that's what teaches me that I can do this.
Similar, I'm not sure if it was Michael Jordan, but basically he kept somewhat of a tally of the amount of shots he missed. One very interesting thing on what you said is, actually I've been doing a study on why people start businesses, right? What are the motivators? But there's actually another study that is about personality types, the big five. And one thing I noticed in what you said that you were taught was actually you've got a strong sense of conscientiousness, which was built into you even by your father, for example. Hey, there's other people that are depending on you. There's that level of diligence and continuity. A low level of neuroticism, definitely.
That's another podcast.
That's another podcast. But I had to throw that in because I'm probably going to steal that clip, because you perfectly actually brought that out. Now, so in terms of your mindset, I understand where it comes from. Now, someone that doesn't have that mindset is going to have a harder time dealing with adversity. From all you've learned, your experience dealing with other entrepreneurs, which I'm sure you've come across many that they're going through struggle, if you
Absolutely.
right? Or something's not working quite right. What's the best piece of advice you can give someone in terms of overcoming adversity and actually being future focused? Hey, this is going to pass, right?
Yeah, so a couple of things. And none of it is rocket science. A lot of it is basic common sense. But I often think of, you know, for people who are athletes, like being on the balls of your feet. Because things happen and you can't be flat-footed. You have to be ready to move, and you have to constantly take in information. Mm-hmm. So the pace can be exhausting. So one of the things I always say, and I suffer from this myself, is, you know, when you get worn down emotionally as an entrepreneur, you get worn down financially as an entrepreneur, you get worn down physically as an entrepreneur, you have to have an outlet. And what I like to tell people is expect that you'll have those down periods, because when they hit you like a ton of bricks and you're unprepared, it's hard enough to figure out a problem. It's even harder to figure out the solution to the problem when you feel like you've been hit by a 50-foot wave. So that's one thing that I think is extremely important, is being flexible and understanding that it's going to be a long haul. And the other piece is, you hear a lot of VCs say, I don't invest in someone who hasn't failed. I want to know that they learned something. And failure, they glamorize failure. So here's what I would say, as someone who's failed many times. It hurts. It's like, I describe failure as a sucker punch to the gut, where you're just totally unprepared and you're hunched over, but you have to catch your breath. So to me, it's all about that idea of, you have to get up. What do you need to accomplish? Do you need this to pay your bills? Do you need this to pay your employees? How can you use your substantial brain and whatever talents and network you have to figure out a solution? And I find it comforting to say, like you did, this is hard. Business is hard. Business of any kind. Life is hard. You know, people have challenges every day, you know, of all kinds. And I feel like being realistic and not pessimistic helps a lot, in the sense that I don't like being surprised. And whenever I'm working with someone or we're hiring someone, I say, I don't like surprises. And by that, I mean, you can tell me a problem, but tell it to me when it happens. And at the same time, if you can, tell me what the solution is. because stuff happens and you just have to be prepared. So you take off the rose-colored glasses. It's going to take longer. It's going to be more expensive. It's going to be harder. God forbid, you might have to deal with a global pandemic that totally changes how we do business. Mm-hmm. And, you know, not everyone's going to survive, but know that you did every single thing you could to enable the success of whatever you're working on. And if you did, you know, failure still hurts. It's, in my mind, I think that's something that people should know. It really hurts, but it feels a lot different if you left everything on the court, so to speak, if you did literally everything you could.
Okay, so if I had to summarize, and actually this is something I do, so I'm going to be cheeky and put my 2 cents in here. I actually give myself some woe is me time.
Absolutely.
Right? So when things don't go right, but I actually give it an end time. So
yes, that's great.
Depending on how big it is, right? If it's pretty massive, look, I need 2 days of woe is me because everything burnt to the ground, or I need 10 minutes because what I'm doing is frustrating.
I love that.
And then there's this other part, and I'm trying to put the words correctly. And I think it's turning to, you made the point about realism, and sometimes pessimism is not realism. It's actually far from it. Pragmatism doesn't mean thinking things aren't possible. I think it's turning the mindset to what's possible with the resources I have and the resources I can acquire.
In this situation that I find myself in.
And you know, the other part there, I'm sorry, I went ahead there, but so a sense of, I think a sense of looking at what resources are available and being very analytical on that can help change the mindset from, look, this is the situation, as an example, for COVID-19. What are the resources I have available to keep my business going, to build my business into the future? And also, what is real? What is it going to look like after this? Which brings me to my last question for you, which is, and it's a double barrel question, how is COVID-19 impacting your business outlook? And what's your plan for post-COVID-19?
You had said something earlier on that you thought it would be a golden age for entrepreneurship, and I think it will. I think the people who survive will be stronger, leaner, you know, and more disciplined. But for me, there's, you know, I'm learning how to do things differently. I've done a lot of my career. I can work literally anywhere. You know, you can put me in a bus station, but the idea that you can't leave, you know, puts a different spin on it. So the things that have changed for me. So I do a lot of focus groups. I do a lot of moderating because I like to hear straight from the proverbial horse's mouth what the users are thinking. So we've had to move all of our clients to virtual focus groups. So it's not that we don't use Zoom or we don't use things all the time, but now you have to figure out how do you change the dynamic and keep consumers engaged when you were in a room and you could force feed them sugar if you needed to. How do you get the output that you need for the client? So doing something that I've done 1,000 times before takes a lot more planning now. So I have to plan my project time differently. I have to think about how I price it differently because it's a different world. The other piece that I notice is that I work with a lot of corporations, and relative to startups, you know, their timelines are longer. I'm finding it that they're getting even slower without people working in the office. So I think the entrepreneurs are having an easier time adapting. So what I'm doing is, which is part of what I always do, is reach out when I see a resource that I think could help someone, or when I can find a way to make something easier for somebody. My focus in my work, in addition to growing businesses, is I want to make someone's job easier. So I often think about how, with these relationships that I have in this environment, can I make their life easier? Whether it's being a resource or offering to do a kind of project that I wouldn't normally do, but using my own advice, being on the balls of my feet, because decision-making is slower. The other thing that I did that I just launched today, which I'm excited about, is everyone talks about the importance of community and, you know, FaceTiming friends and all that. So I love the people in the space. So I came up with this idea that I was going to do a bunch of short interviews called Quotes from Quarantine. And so I sent out an email to people in femtech and sex tech and related businesses, because as you started this, these businesses in and of themselves have some unique idiosyncratic challenges in terms of access to media and access to funding. So I thought, in this environment, why not do something I love, which is learn from people and have interesting conversations. And I sent out an email yesterday and I had a positive response of 33% in 12 hours.
Nice.
So that's exciting for me. So that does a few things. It keeps me engaged with the community. It keeps me having conversations. It keeps me learning. Usually I spend an enormous amount of time reading, and I do that even more so. I'm sure, like everybody else, you have this file of to be read when I have 12 straight days and I'm trapped in the house, because by virtue of not traveling, there are many, many hours more that I have in the day. So that's what I think about. I think about coming up with creative ideas, figuring out a way to be meaningful to the people that you work with. And that doesn't necessarily mean, because I'm all about capitalism, that you're doing things for free. But is there a way you can structure a deal for someone to acquire a company in a way that's different now? Can you serve up solutions differently? And it requires, going back to the very first thing we talked about, is understanding what their needs are. And folks are struggling. I mean, you and I do calls all the time, and you know, a lot of our work is remote. If that's not natural, that's a whole new skill set that lots of people have to use. And so I have to continue to teach myself patience as I learn some new tools, and as the people that I work with are learning new tools.
That's awesome. That's actually, I love it. I genuinely do. And I really like as well your focus on helping people. If you can make their life easier, if you can help them solve a problem. And I believe that's probably why a lot of your work continued to come from J&J and so on, from Johnson & Johnson.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And that's, you've got an amazing mindset.
Thank you.
And it has been a pleasure. I want to be mindful of your time.